Testimony continues today in a hearing to determine whether a teenage murder suspect's case will stay in adult court.
Today, the 15-year-old's social condition was discussed. The teen, who has not been identified by name, is accused of sexually assaulting and killing 10-year-old Lily Peters in Chippewa County.
In today's hearing, witnesses testified about the potential of the suspect being on the autism spectrum and how that could affect his ability to understand the cause of causing harm. And experts said it will likely diminish the suspect's understanding of harm, but that it wasn't completely eliminated. Another witness testified that the defendant had a difficult family setting and no peer relationships with friendships with children his own age. We'll continue to follow the latest on this case both on air and online at NBC15.com.